The Portuguese Empire. When small became too small. The year is 1822, and in the Ipiranga River Valley near São Paulo, Brazil, the heir to the Portuguese throne has just committed an act that ends 3 centuries of imperial history. Prince Pedro, regent of Brazil while his father governs Portugal, has received a letter from the Portuguese parliament demanding his return to Lisbon and the reduction of Brazil to its former colonial status. Instead of complying, Pedro draws his sword and shouts, "Independence or death," declaring Brazil independent from Portugal and himself its emperor. The colony that accounts for the vast majority of Portuguese imperial territory, population, and wealth has just seceded, not conquered by a foreign power, but separated by a member of the Portuguese royal family, who has concluded that Brazil's future lies in independence rather than continued subordination to a small, poor European kingdom. Within months, Portugal will recognize Brazilian independence because it lacks the military power, the financial resources, or the will to fight. The Portuguese Empire, which had been the first truly global empire, which had pioneered the sea routes to Asia and Brazil, which had once dominated the Indian Ocean spice trade and the Atlantic slave trade, has just lost its most valuable possession, not to a rival empire, but to its own inability to maintain control. What remains of the Portuguese Empire, a few coastal enclaves in Africa and Asia, the remote colony of Macau, will persist for another century and a half, but, as anachronisms, colonial relics maintained more by the disinterest of great powers than by Portuguese strength. The empire that began with Vasco da Gama reaching India in 1498, that created the first global trading network, that demonstrated that European powers could dominate transoceanic trade, has become an irrelevance, and the question that haunts Portuguese history is simple but devastating. How did the first global empire become the first to fade into insignificance? The story begins not with inevitable failure, but with extraordinary success that seems, in retrospect, almost miraculous. Portugal in the 15th century is a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, with perhaps 1 million people, limited resources, no great power, and no obvious destiny except perhaps to be absorbed by its much larger neighbor, Castile. But Portugal has 2 advantages: a long Atlantic coastline that makes it naturally oriented toward the sea, and Prince Henry the Navigator, a royal prince who becomes obsessed with exploration and who dedicates Portugal to maritime expansion. Beginning in the 1410s and continuing through the century, Portuguese expeditions systematically explore the African coast, pushing further south with each voyage, mapping currents and winds, establishing trading posts, and gradually solving the navigational problems that had made oceanic voyaging terrifyingly dangerous. The Portuguese developed the caravel, a ship design that can sail into the wind and handle ocean swells, making long-distance oceanic voyaging practical. They developed better navigational instruments and techniques, accumulating knowledge about winds, currents, and routes. They established fortified trading posts along the African coast, trading in gold, ivory, and increasingly slaves with African kingdoms. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships have rounded the southern tip of Africa, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama reaches India, opening the sea route from Europe to Asia that bypasses the Ottoman-controlled land routes and the Venetian Arab middlemen who had dominated the spice trade. It is one of history's most important voyages, comparable to Columbus's discovery of America 6 years earlier, and it makes Portugal the first European power to access Asian markets directly by sea. What follows is a burst of imperial expansion so rapid It seems almost hallucinatory. Within 2 decades, Portugal establishes trading posts and fortresses from East Africa through India, the Malay archipelago, and to the Spice Islands themselves, the source of cloves and nutmeg that Europeans crave. Portuguese ships reach China and Japan, opening direct European contact with East Asia. In the Atlantic, Portugal claims Brazil after Pedro Álvares Cabral's accidental landfall in 1500, establishing a colony that will eventually dwarf all other Portuguese possessions. By 1520, the Portuguese Empire encompasses trading posts and colonies on 4 continents, creating the first global empire, a network of fortified bases connected by sea routes that only Portuguese navigators have mastered. For a brief period, roughly from 1500 to 1580, Portugal dominates transoceanic trade between Europe, Africa, and Asia, controlling the flow of spices, silks, and other luxury goods that are phenomenally profitable. The Portuguese strategy in Asia is to control key strategic points, ports, straits, islands, and to dominate trade through naval superiority rather than to conquer large territories. Alfonso de Albuquerque, the greatest Portuguese imperial architect, captures Goa in 1510, which becomes the capital of Portuguese India. He captures Malacca in 1511, controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. He captures Hormuz in 1515, controlling the entrance to the Persian Gulf. These fortified bases allow Portugal to dominate trade routes, requiring Asian merchants to buy licenses and pay tolls to the Portuguese, creating a protection racket backed by superior naval power. Portuguese ships are larger, better armed and more maneuverable than Asian vessels, and for several decades, Portuguese naval superiority allows a few thousand Portuguese soldiers and sailors scattered across dozens of fortresses to dominate Asian waters. The profits are enormous. Spices that cost almost nothing in the Spice Islands sell for hundreds of times their purchase price in Europe. A single successful voyage can make investors fabulously wealthy. The Portuguese crown claims monopoly over the spice trade, and for several decades, this monopoly generates more revenue than any other source. The Casa da India in Lisbon manages the trade, and ships arriving from India with holds full of pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg create fortunes for the crown and for the merchants and nobles who invest in the voyages. Lisbon becomes one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, its docks piled with Asian goods, its streets full of foreign merchants, its treasury overflowing with customs revenue. But the seeds of failure are present from the beginning, inherent in the very nature of Portuguese expansion. The first and most fundamental problem is that Portugal is simply too small. With a population of perhaps 1 to 1.5 million in the early 16th century, Portugal lacks the human resources to populate and defend a global empire. The entire Portuguese population is smaller than the population of a single major Asian city, like Constantinople, or Vijayanagar, or Beijing. To maintain fortresses across 3 continents, Portugal must send thousands of men overseas annually, and many of them die from disease, warfare, or shipwreck. The attrition rate for Portuguese going to Asia is horrific, perhaps 50% or more dying on the voyage or within a few years of arrival. Portugal is bleeding population it cannot afford to lose. The second problem is military. Portuguese naval superiority in the early 16th century is real, but fragile and temporary. It depends on Asian powers being unfamiliar with European naval warfare and on Portugal maintaining technological superiority in ship design and gunnery. But both conditions erode quickly. Asian powers learn European tactics, build or acquire European-style ships, and hire European renegades and mercenaries to train their forces. By the mid-16th century, Ottoman Turkish fleets in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf threaten Portuguese control. Asian pirates adopt Portuguese ship designs and weapons. Local rulers organize better defenses against Portuguese attacks. Most critically, other European powers, the Dutch, English, and French, arrive in Asian waters with ships and guns as good or better than Portuguese, and they are not bound by any respect for Portuguese monopoly claims. Portuguese naval superiority, which had been the foundation of their Asian empire, disappears within a century of its establishment. The third problem is economic. The Portuguese trade monopoly is more theory than reality. Portugal cannot actually prevent Asian merchants from trading, cannot patrol all sea routes, cannot enforce licenses and tolls everywhere. Portuguese officials are corrupt, selling licenses illegally, allowing prohibited trade in exchange for bribes, and enriching themselves rather than the crown. Smuggling is endemic. Portuguese merchants themselves violate the crown monopoly when it suits them. Moreover, the spice trade, while highly profitable, is also volatile and risky. Prices fluctuate wildly based on supply and European demand. Ships are lost to storms, pirates, and war. The infrastructure of empire, maintaining fortresses, paying soldiers and officials, supplying bases thousands of miles from Portugal, is expensive and consumes much of the profit from trade. By the mid-16th century, the costs of maintaining the empire are eating into the profits of trade. The fourth problem is that Portugal never develops a manufacturing base or diversified economy. Like Spain with American silver, Portugal with Asian spices becomes dependent on a single source of wealth rather than developing a broad economic foundation. Portuguese manufacturing is minimal, agriculture is neglected, and Portugal becomes dependent on importing food and manufactured goods, paying for them with spice trade profits. When spice prices decline, or when competition erodes the monopoly, Portugal has no alternative sources of wealth. The Portuguese economy is essentially a transit point for Asian goods flowing to Europe and European goods flowing to Asia, with profits extracted from brokerage rather than from production. This works as long as Portugal maintains its monopoly and its Asian bases, but it creates no sustainable economic foundation. The fifth problem is political and dynastic. In 1580, Portugal loses its independence when King Sebastian dies without an heir after a disastrous military expedition to Morocco. Philip II of Spain claims the Portuguese throne through inheritance and invades Portugal, uniting it with Spain in a personal union. For the next 60 years, until 1640, Portugal is ruled by Spanish kings, and Portuguese interests are subordinated to Spanish interests. The union is catastrophic for the Portuguese Empire. Spain's enemies, particularly the Dutch and English, now treat Portuguese possessions as Spanish possessions and attack them accordingly. The Dutch, fighting for independence from Spain, systematically assault Portuguese positions in Asia and Brazil. Between 1600 and 1660, the Dutch conquer most of Portuguese Asia, taking Malacca, Ceylon, and the Spice Islands themselves, destroying the Portuguese monopoly and creating their own. Portuguese Brazil is temporarily lost to Dutch conquest, though it is eventually recovered. By the time Portugal regains independence in 1640, its Asian empire has been largely destroyed, reduced to a few fortified enclaves like Goa and Macau. Brazil becomes Portugal's salvation and ultimately its limitation. Portuguese settlement in Brazil begins slowly in the early 16th century with little government investment or interest. The indigenous population is sparse. The land is covered in dense forests, and initially there seems little of value. But the development of sugar plantations worked by African slave labor transforms Brazil into Portugal's most valuable possession. By the 17th century, Brazilian sugar is generating more wealth than the Asian spice trade, and Brazil is receiving far more Portuguese immigrants than Asia ever did. The Portuguese population of Brazil grows to hundreds of thousands and then millions, dwarfing the few thousand Portuguese scattered across Asian fortresses. Brazil develops a complex colonial society with Portuguese landowners, African slaves, indigenous peoples, and increasingly, a mixed-race population. By the 18th century, discovery of gold and diamonds in the interior makes Brazil even more valuable, and Portugal becomes almost completely dependent on Brazilian wealth. But this dependency creates a new problem. Brazil is so much larger and wealthier than Portugal that the relationship between metropole and colony becomes inverted. By the late 18th century, Brazil has perhaps 3 million people compared to Portugal's 3 million. But Brazil's economy is more dynamic, its territory vastly larger, and its strategic importance greater. Portugal becomes less a colonial power dominating Brazil than a European appendage to a Brazilian economy. When Napoleon invades Portugal in 1807, the Portuguese royal family flees to Brazil, an unprecedented event where the metropole falls to invasion while the colony survives intact. The court spends over a decade in Rio de Janeiro, which becomes the de facto capital of the Portuguese Empire. This period confirms Brazil's importance and makes clear that Portuguese dependence on Brazil is complete. When the royal family returns to Portugal in 1821, they leave Prince Pedro as regent in Brazil, and the Portuguese parliament attempts to reassert control by demanding Brazil's return to colonial status and Pedro's return to Lisbon. This provocation triggers Brazilian independence. Pedro sides with Brazilian interests against Portuguese authority. Brazilian elites support independence, and Portugal lacks the means to prevent it. The loss of Brazil in 1822 eliminates the foundation of Portuguese imperial wealth. What remains of the empire, Goa, Macau, Timor, and various African coastal enclaves, generates little revenue and maintains little strategic importance. Portugal is reduced from empire to small European nation, one of the poorest in Western Europe. Portugal's African empire expands in the late 19th century during the scramble for Africa, when European powers carve up the continent. Portugal claims Angola, Mozambique, and other territories, creating colonies much larger than Portugal itself. But this expansion is more on maps than in reality. Portugal lacks the resources to effectively occupy or develop these territories. Portuguese African colonies are poorly administered, minimally developed, and primarily serve as sources of labor exports to other colonies and as markers of Portuguese prestige rather than as sources of wealth. The expansion of Portuguese Africa in the 19th century represents not imperial strength, but weakness, the desperate attempt by declining power to maintain relevance by claiming territories that other powers do not want enough to fight over. The 20th century sees Portugal clinging to its empire long after other European powers have decolonized. The Salazar dictatorship, which rules Portugal from 1932 to 1974, makes colonial retention central to its ideology, arguing that Portugal's African colonies are actually overseas provinces, integral parts of Portugal, rather than colonies to be shed. When African independence movements emerge after World War II, Portugal fights brutal colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau from 1961 to 1974, attempting to maintain control through military force. These wars are expensive, unpopular, and ultimately futile. They consume perhaps 40% of Portugal's budget, kill thousands of Portuguese soldiers, devastate the African territories, and alienate Portugal from the international community. In 1974, a military coup overthrows the dictatorship partly because junior officers fighting in Africa have concluded that the wars are unwinnable. The new government immediately begins decolonization, and by 1975, all Portuguese African colonies are independent. The Portuguese Empire, which had lasted nearly 5 centuries, ends not with any glory but with defeat, exhaustion, and relief that the burden is finally over. So how did the first global empire become the first to fade? The answer lies in the fundamental mismatch between Portuguese resources and imperial ambitions. Portugal was always too small to sustain a global empire. With a tiny population and limited resources, it could establish trading posts, but could not populate colonies, could build fortresses, but could not defend them against determined attack, could claim trade monopolies, but could not enforce them, could create an empire, but could not maintain it. The Portuguese imperial moment, roughly 1500 to 1580, depended on temporary conditions: European naval superiority over Asian powers, the absence of European competitors in Asian waters, and the profitability of monopolizing spice trade. When these conditions changed, when Asian powers adapted, when Dutch and English competitors arrived, when the Spanish Union made Portugal's enemies Portugal's, the empire's foundations collapsed. The comparison with other European empires is instructive. The Spanish Empire was larger and richer, but faced similar problems of overextension and resource dependence. The Dutch Empire that displaced the Portuguese in Asia was more commercially sophisticated, more focused on trade than on territorial control, and backed by a wealthier and more advanced economy. The British Empire that eventually dominated was backed by a much larger population, a much more advanced economy, superior military organization, and more effective institutions. Portugal simply never had the resources to compete with these larger powers. When Portuguese monopoly and naval superiority disappeared, Portugal had nothing else to fall back on. No industrial base, no financial system, no large population, no military might. Just the infrastructure of an empire it could no longer maintain. Brazil's loss in 1822 was particularly devastating because Brazil had become the foundation of Portuguese wealth, and its independence reduced Portugal from empire to insignificant European nation overnight. Unlike Britain losing America, but retaining Canada, India, and colonies worldwide, Portugal losing Brazil meant losing the only part of the empire that generated significant wealth and that could plausibly support metropolitan Portugal. The African colonies that remained were liabilities rather than assets, costing more to administer and defend than they generated in revenue. Portugal's desperation to maintain them until 1975, long after they had any economic or strategic value, reflects not strength, but weakness. The attempt to maintain imperial identity after imperial substance had vanished. The economic failures compound the resource limitations. Portugal never developed industries, never created a diversified economy, never built institutions capable of mobilizing resources effectively. The spice trade profits and later Brazilian gold and sugar flowed through Portugal without creating lasting economic development, much like Spanish-American silver. Portuguese elites consumed profits rather than investing them productively. The Portuguese state remained weak, corrupt, and inefficient, unable to effectively tax or mobilize Portuguese society. When Portugal needed resources to defend its empire against Dutch and English competition, those resources simply did not exist. A richer, more developed Portugal might have better defended its empire. But Portugal never developed that richness, because its empire made development seem unnecessary, while the empire was profitable and impossible once the empire declined. The fundamental irony of Portuguese imperial history is that the very achievement of creating the first global empire ensured that Portugal would be unable to maintain it. By expanding so far and so fast with such limited resources, Portugal created an empire that was inherently unsustainable, that required continuous success just to maintain, and that would collapse rapidly once conditions changed. The Portuguese demonstrated that small European powers with superior naval technology could dominate transoceanic trade, but they also demonstrated that such dominance was temporary, and that empires built on naval superiority and trade monopolies would fall to powers with more resources and more advanced economies. When Portuguese Africa finally gained independence in 1975, when the last remnants of the Portuguese Empire disappeared, except for Macau, which returned to China in 1999, it ended one of history's longest imperial experiences. From Vasco da Gama's arrival in India in 1498 to Macau's handover to China in 1999 is just over 500 years, an impressive span. But for most of those 5 centuries, the Portuguese Empire was a declining power, a collection of increasingly irrelevant enclaves maintained more by the indifference of other powers than by Portuguese strength. The first global empire lasted long, but faded early, demonstrating that being first is no guarantee of permanence, that establishing an empire is easier than maintaining one, and that empires built on temporary advantages and inadequate foundations will collapse when those advantages disappear, and when powers with greater resources and more sustainable foundations emerge to replace them. The Portuguese Empire's rise and fall is ultimately a story of a small nation that achieved greatness briefly through innovation, courage, and favorable circumstances, but that could never translate temporary advantage into permanent power because it lacked the population, resources, and economic development necessary to sustain a global empire. Portugal showed what was possible for small powers, but also showed the limits of what could be achieved without the fundamental strength to back imperial claims. The first global empire became the first to fade because being first is not enough when others can follow and do better, when temporary superiority erodes, and when the mismatch between ambitions and capabilities becomes too great to sustain. Portugal's imperial history is a 500-year demonstration that size matters, that resources matter, that economic development matters, and that empires built on foundations too narrow and too weak will crumble when challenged by rivals with broader foundations and greater strength, regardless of how impressive their initial achievements or how long they persist as fading memories of former glory.